alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to Alive After Reading. I'm your host, Tim Niederreiter, author of the Demon Hunter series, the Twisted Gods series, and a lot of other books. But with me today is a new guest to the podcast, Zachary Hagen. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you, and you have some... is this your first book you have out here? Or, tell readers a little bit about your books and yourself.
Yeah, so I have one full novel out and a novel planning workbook for aspiring or experienced writers who might want to try a different approach, and a short story that was sort of a mini prequel to my first full novel. So, yeah, and I write, I teach, and I do a lot of other stuff. Of course, my day is filled with a lot. But I'm really trying to make a go of this writing thing. I have some stories to tell, and I'm really excited about the series that I'm working on right now.
Excellent. What's the series called?
So it's called the Eternal Chronicles, and the first book, Eternity's Well, released on I believe it was the 31st of August. So
wow, okay.
About 2 weeks from the release now.
Okay, well, and a little further when people actually hear this, it'll be a month or two. From the release, because I have a buffer for once. Anyway, that's just a minor thing.
That's good. Planning is awesome.
Yeah, we're recording slightly in advance. The curtain. Let's put that curtain back, though. Okay, so so Zachary, you've got. I did have a chance to read the beginning of this book, and it's very fast paced. This opening, I only had a chance to read like the first paragraph. It's like, okay, so there's action right away.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, do you find it easy to write action, or is it just kind of something, or is it more difficult for you? I guess, yeah.
I think so. The beginning of the book changed a lot. I will say, however, when I read through the book, doing my own editing, that I noticed that it was very fast paced, and I think that comes from me actually having ADHD and not being able to go at a slow pace.
Preach.
So, yeah. So I think that readers, especially modern readers, will find it very accessible because it doesn't tend to sit in one place for too long and get boring. I might step on some toes here, but I had a hard time initially reading the Lord of the Rings series. I love the series, I do, but I had to really hunker down when I read it.
I still prefer The Hobbit to that series, to the main, to the big series. I do like The Lord of the Rings, but I prefer The Hobbit, to put things in perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
The Hobbit is a little bit more accessible.
Yeah. I just think how it's written, and the fact that it's basically a bunch of little adventures is much more attractive to me as a book these days.
Yes. I think that stands up well to time at this point. But the great thing is that the movies did a good job of telling stories. Some
Very true.
Might not agree.
No, I agree with that, though.
I feel like it hit all the necessary points.
The Lord of the Rings movie is much better than the Hobbit movies. Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Basically. Anyway, that's not what we're here to talk about, but it is, it's something I think most listeners will know my opinion on that stuff already. But at least I think so. I feel like everyone kind of could read my mind at this point because I'm so wandering when I do this show. I mean, I'll go everywhere. But so this book's fantasy, correct? Or is it sci-fi? Is it somewhere in between?
It is. So I had this concept. I actually started working on the initial concept for this book before the movie Onward came out. And so when I saw the first trailers for Onward, I'm like, that's basically my fantasy world. Because I wanted sort of high fantasy, but set in a modern world with cell phones and trains and all these things that we're used to. Because I felt like the medieval era has been done to death. Everyone reads a fantasy book and expects to see swords and things like that. And there are elements of that in my series. But it's not the only thing that's there. You shouldn't expect a bunch of swordplay and battles and high speech with these and thous. It's very much built on a modern world with elements of high fantasy that keep up the tradition while modernizing it.
That makes sense. I'm guilty of, I wouldn't say guilty, but I definitely enjoy writing that style of fiction as well. I mean, I tend to blend the sci-fi and the fantasy, and because I feel like the modern world is really interesting, and I don't want to leave all of that out when I approach writing a fantasy story. I mean, I do it sometimes because sometimes that's what I'm going for, but when I write, like, I have this one idea, but though actually, let me step back and say, having a movie kind of come out in advance of your book release, that's like, wait, that's what I was trying to do. That is a really funny problem to have. I mean, and not even really a problem, not a big problem necessarily, but it is one of those, like, I remember it was before Pacific Rim. I think this is a little bit more understandable, but I had a story that actually ended up being a lot like Pacific Rim, having a lot of parallels. And not giant robots, though. So people wouldn't even necessarily say it was parallel, but they were people fighting sea creatures. And they always worked in teams of 2 to be the most effective.
Wow.
So, that was a novel I wrote when I was a teenager. And, they made that into a movie eventually. So actually, I technically beat them to the punch, but I didn't publish that one. So it was too much of a mess.
Right.
That's what teenage novels tend to be, or at least mine were, for the most part. Anyway, it sounds like you got a nice dog over there, an animal of some kind anyway.
I do. My dog Flynn is wanting attention while I'm doing this, so I'm keeping him at bay. Well,
excellent. You know, you gotta take care of the animals, but also, as far as books go, I know you mentioned we've been talking about the pace, you know, and I've been reading some books that are similarly fast paced, but they're very old. They're like released by the standards of fantasy novels. They're like 50 years old now. Which are not as old as Lord of the Rings, but in the interim, there was a period where heroic fantasy was very very powerful, right, as a part of the genre. But I found that now that, like with Brandon Sanderson and all the other kind of lineage of Robert Jordan running things, fantasy's turned into these big fat books that are always like, and there's nothing wrong with those, except that they're just not my taste, and I'm kind of coming to grips with that. Because I read a bunch of Brandon Sanderson and other, you know, big fantasies, and I'm like, why are these not doing it for me? You know? Oh, yeah. Why are these not doing it for? Do you have any books that you've thought were kind of what you needed to do, or has that not been an obstacle for you?
To a certain extent, absolutely. Because I have wanted to be a writer and a teacher for as long as I can remember, and so I got the teaching thing, and then writing still hadn't happened for my first year of teaching. And so, but the obstacle for me was I loved the inheritance cycle as middle school going into my teenage years, as they were coming out, well, even younger than middle school, I guess, because I was a big reader. I started reading, I think, Aragon maybe when I was in 3rd grade. So Christopher Paolini, while a huge role model in some ways, has also been a source of intimidation, because he finished the novel when he was 15, and it's an enormous book. So I felt some of that imposter syndrome, and I reminded myself, well, other fantasy authors especially have not gotten their start until later into their adult years, and I'm still relatively young. I have published my first novel before I'm 30, so I'd say that on the grand scheme of things, I'm still ahead of the curve in some ways. Not that that's a goal, but learning to measure things differently than what other people have done has been a challenge, but it's also made my writing better, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, despite the hairline difference, I'm probably not a whole lot older than you are, honestly. And for a non-video, which I guess is all of you viewers, yeah, I am a baldy, and Zachary is not. But Point is, I maybe like I judging by your the time you're reading the Inheritance series, I was not into. I never got into those books, but I know when they came out. I think I wrote my first book in a similar time period, so I'm probably a few years younger than Pauline and a few years older than you. Mm-hmm. But anyway, and I was like 13 when I wrote my first book, but it wasn't super long. Let me put it that way. It was pretty normal length book, 65,000 or something. So anyway, my point here is that there is a certain amount of like, well, yeah, I mean, you know, when you're 30, like what was I said Sanderson before? What was Brandon Sanderson doing when he was 30? Well, he was working in a hotel, writing his books on the night shift. I think that's the right time frame. I'm just from my writing excuses lore, and my Brandon Sanderson lore isn't strong as it once was, but it's still there. I mean, it took this guy a long time. He wrote, what is it, 12 books or something before he published anything. And these are Brandon Sanderson books, and he's not a super swift writer by the word per minute metric. Yeah. He writes like 500 words an hour. So yeah, he's just a dedicated guy. And so, of course, but the difference here is the time scale is, you know, the people who are, you know, and there's a lot of people. I actually was approached today when I was writing by this guy who's probably in his 80s and was talking about writing his first book. So it works differently for everybody, obviously.
Absolutely.
But so you always wanted to be a writer, is that true?
That is absolutely true. In fact, on my bio in my books and on my author page, it says, like, my first little book, my first little story was about a dragon who gave flowers to children. So it very simplistic. I think my parents might actually still have it. It was a bunch of little pieces of paper stapled together with pictures drawn in it and words with some of the letters backwards, Pooh Bear style. So for longer than I can remember, because I don't remember writing it. I just know that was the case, was that I wanted to write. I wanted to tell stories. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's a powerful thing. And a lot of people, and there's a lot of writers who come to it at all stages, but I identify the most personally with people like you. I should say people like us who grew up, you know, always wanting to tell stories. I started with role-playing games really young too. I was like 6 or 7 when I played my first role-playing game, and of course that put me right on the world building bandwagon pretty fast, because I mean D&D and then the fantasy worlds that kind of spring from that. And Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40,000. These are my big influences. So what are some of your influences? I mean, you mentioned Inheritance, but what are some other things that speak to you and maybe influence your books?
Oh gosh, definitely C.S. Lewis. I think the first full series that I ever read all the way through, when I first grew to love reading, was the Chronicles of Narnia, and it was just such a masterfully well-crafted story from the beginning to the end of this world that he created, and it had such enduring themes that I feel like resonate really well, even still with audiences today.
Absolutely. And it's funny because C.S. Lewis, I mean, he had a variety of books that weren't Narnia, and I've read most of the books I've read of him were actually those. It's kind of funny. Right. I never quite got around to Narnia. Yeah.
Yeah, because he has his sci-fi series as well. Things like the Screw Tape Letters and all his sort of apologetic sort of books, because he was a devout Christian.
Yeah.
And he also has a ton of writing on the medieval time period, because what a lot of people don't know is that he wasn't specifically an author and that was his main source of living. He was an Oxford professor that taught medieval history.
Like Tolkien, who taught linguistics. Yeah. Like a philologist. Yeah. And they were buddies. They were the same time period. So they were colleagues as well as friends. Yeah.
And another fun fact that I love, Tolkien hated the Chronicles of Narnia.
You know why that was, though?
He hated allegory.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I'm not a fan of allegory either in most cases. I mean, it's not, I don't hate, I wouldn't say I hate it. I don't feel that strongly, but it is not my favorite thing in a fantasy story. If it's like, well, this is all just, the point of this is it's a reflection of the real world. I'm like, that's a boring thing.
It takes a lot to do allegory well, I will say. I feel like C.S. Lewis did it well, but he also wasn't. Some readers might know Pilgrim's Progress. It's this Christian allegory, and it's very kind of obvious and not at all. Some people love it. I find it very odd to read because the characters' names are literally what they are, and that just feels condescending to me.
Maybe a little postmodern too, in a way, like just like out there and like this. You're just saying what you're just out there. It's like you're on stage and you're showing us the behind the curtain at the same time, or whatever. Right. You can see all the changes happening behind. It's that kind of vibe, almost meta fiction in that way.
Right. Whereas I think with a lot, I mean, obviously some things in C.S. Lewis's work were very obvious, but other things were not, and you really had to dig for the hidden meaning. And I feel like that kind of allegory where some things aren't on the surface, on the nose, is very good because it makes you look for the answers rather than being presented to you.
That's a great point, yeah.
The thing is, we're told because I took creative writing classes in college, we're told to let the reader fill in some of the blanks. That you can trust the reader with the story, that you do not have to make everything painstakingly obvious. And so, even in my books where there are themes from different areas of my life that I incorporated, a lot of it is not on the nose. And some of it was even like conversations that I was having with myself between two characters, coping with my own trauma. And so there's elements of allegory in my books, but it's definitely not like me pouring my heart out on the page in a sense where you're going to know exactly what I was going through when I was writing that scene.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's funny now. I just recently released the Twisted Gods, the books in the Twisted Gods series, and one of the things that people are going to might find interesting about this, and I'm getting to a question, but one of the things people might find a little odd is that there's some situations that kind of recur on the grand scale in the course of these books, mostly. And the funny thing is that with this book and then one of my older books, Origin of Storms, there's other ones as well. The Mangrove Suite is the other one. So that's like 3 books, and they all have this kind of weird hook that's similar to them to each other. They have like this because they all came from the same like year that I was writing them, and I had that one thought in my mind. Does that kind of thing has that sort of thing ever cropped up for you in like the recurring motifs or systems or whatever in your fiction?
Right. Well, I mean, that's a difficult and an easy question to answer at the same time because, one, my series is my work in progress. So I'm working on the sequel right now. It's about halfway through the first draft. I'm aiming to be done in about 3 weeks. So I'm very close.
Hopefully by the time this episode drops then, yeah.
Hopefully by the time this episode drops, it should be in the editing stages. My editor should have it, and she should be thrilled with where the story is going, hopefully. So yes, there are absolutely recurring themes. Because the whole series kind of centers around this idea of loss and redemption and brotherhood and friendship and family and what that means on sort of a minuscule scale and a grand scale, because these characters lose what means the most to them in their sort of minuscule microcosms of their world, and then they're thrust onto this plane where suddenly so much more has to become important to them in such a short amount of time, and some of them don't cope well with that. They aren't sure how to make that jump from caring about their world to caring about the world.
That's a great theme. Jeez. And well articulated, sir. That sounds like a very powerful way to tell the tale, actually. I am looking forward to reading the rest of it at this point. So Yeah, so but I do have a brief question for you because we are I think running a little bit low on time here, and that is that how long do you foresee this series being? You got one book and 1.5 books now. How long do you plan to have it to go, or do you not know yet?
So I have a 5-book arc planned for the main series. If I see some good success with that, I will probably do spin-offs with it. I think once I get to about 10, 12 books, if it still is having success, I think at that point I'm going to have to jump to another project, because that's essentially going to be 4 or 5 years that I'm spending with this one world, and I think at that point I would be ready to try something else.
Makes sense to me. I have a hard time sticking to the same world between books. I jump around so much.
Right.
And I also have ADHD, full disclosure, so that's I see that as being something similar. Go on, though.
Yeah. Well, people will probably see that with the first book is that, well, I don't want to give too much away, but there is definitely sort of a drastic change in scenery between the first and the second books. It's not a permanent change, but it does... I'm a big believer in using setting as a giant part of telling the story, because it's where the characters are. And you can derive so much from where they are and what's around them to inform the story.
Absolutely. And it's also where they come from in a lot of cases. They come from a part of it at any rate.
Right.
And that kind of story, that kind, in a fantasy setting, that can really inform who the characters are, as well as what
absolutely.
they do. Yeah.
Absolutely. Because, well, really, if I'm being completely transparent and maybe dropping a little nugget that wouldn't be obviously picked up by readers,
drop it.
Pick up the book. None of the 4 main characters in the first book are the same species, at least not strictly speaking.
Okay.
So there's differences culturally and metaphysically, and one of the characters is from a different dimension. So it's a really interesting thing to see how they interacted. I'm mostly a plotter, but as I got to know the characters, I was like, I had to change some things because I wasn't being 100% accurate to their personalities.
Yeah, the pantsing sneaks up on you. The discovery sneaks up on you.
It does. I like knowing a broad idea of what's going to happen, but the characters have to be honest, just as much as I have to be honest.
Well, that makes sense, and it's been really good talking to you, Zach. Remind people where they can find the book, and yeah, thanks for being on the show.
Absolutely. So Eternity's Well is on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. So pretty much anywhere you would buy a book.
Can you find? Do you have a website too? Do you have a website? Yeah.
So it's currently in construction, but it will be ZacharyHagenWrites.com once it's up, which it should be up by the time this is airing.
Excellent. So check all that out, folks. And yeah, thanks for being on the show again, Zachary. And as for this podcast, you can find more of us at mentalcellarpublications.com. You can find my books on Amazon.com or the print books anywhere print books can be found, on print-on-demand books can be found. And yeah, also, you should be what people should be looking for right now is definitely The Forgotten Mask, which is the first book of the Twisted Gods series, and Beloved of Death, the second book of that series, which is pretty. They're both new. They both get one in August, one in September. And hopefully, by the time this drops, we'll be looking at Time's Needle dropping in October. That's book 3. Yeah. Anyway, folks, go find the books. I have a bunch of books out there. This will be 15 at this point when Time's Needle drops. So the needle will drop in October. Thanks for listening, everybody. Or maybe it already has. Keep looking. Keep watching the skies. Take it easy, folks. Thanks for listening, and have a good evening or day or whenever it is you are listening to it. Yes, I have screwed up the outro again. It's mandatory. Take it easy, folks. Goodbye.
That tears it.